Welcome to the inaugural episode of Ancient Geeks, a podcast from a couple of seasoned, should we say old, geeks. Here is where we're going to explore the geek culture from the perspective of the past when we were young geeks, and then looking also at the culture of the present, how that culture came to be, what it was like to be there at the inception of geek culture and its many threads. We were geeks before it was cool. My name is Tom Grant. I'm one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Stephen Taylor, your other co-host.
And since this is our inaugural episode, really we're going to talk about ourselves quite a lot. So you'll get a good grasp of the perspective that we're coming from, being the younger geeks that we were. When we talk about comics and movies and all sorts of things, we're going to use that as our starting point. But Stephen, why don't you say what this podcast is about in a little bit more depth?
So sure, our goal here is to think about the way in which we encountered all this geek culture, like you say, comics and movies and TV shows and all their various iterations, and how when we were younger, it was kind of unusual and maybe outside the mainstream. But over time, these all become really part of the mainstream. Like some of the most highest grossing films right now are almost all fall within the area of geek culture, whether it's the MCU or Star Wars or just various science fiction and fantasy outputs. I mean, some of the biggest TV shows of late have been things like Game of Thrones or The Rings of Power. These are money makers and they're huge, and it's not as odd to be interested in these things as it used to be. So we want to think about the way in which, what's become the acceptance over time of these things that used to be niche, how society kind of caught up and how we experience that, right? And also sort of an opportunity to think about the importance of these properties, this intellectual property to us and to the broader culture over a multi-decade perspective.
Yeah, so that's our mandate here as a podcast. So a little bit about ourselves. I am currently living in Colorado. I'm a retired tech professional. I used to live in Southern California, where Stephen and I both met many decades ago. And I'll have a lot to say about my early life in Southern California, from when I was growing up and became a young geek. How about yourself, Stephen?
So I'm a retired university professor and college administrator. Um, in fact, it's probably worth pointing out that Tom and I both have PhDs in political science, which is, perhaps the nerdiest or the geekiest of educational attainments.
It's our
Um,
it's our our stigma.
Without any
It's our
doubt.
mark of shame.
So, we met, and I think probably to give a perspective, right? We met in the '80s. We all became of age. Tom's a little older than I am, but we became of age of geeks in the '70s, maybe a little earlier, a little later, depending on the way you want to look at it. I currently reside in Alabama. I'm originally from Texas, but we did meet in California. We were both students at UC Irvine back in the day, although Tom was a little ahead of me. In fact, he was one of my professors in a class at one point and a teaching assistant other times. Well, I was just a snot-nosed undergraduate.
Well, I was a snot-nosed graduate. I think being snot-nosed is required in
I
political science.
almost certainly to be, to fit some of the which we may talk about, some of the imagery of nerdery in particular. Snot-nosed apparently is de rigueur, or at least having a whiny voice and high-waisted pants.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So we're going to dive in a bit with our origin stories. I think that's an appropriate way to frame what we're doing in this particular episode. And I'll go first, kind of talking about the very earliest connections I made as a kid to what we now call geek culture. So for me, probably the TV show behind my own geekdom, it was Batman. Not surprisingly, I mean, I was of an age where I remember watching it when it came out as a little kid, and later watching it in reruns. This led to an interest in early comics. Not surprisingly, I focused a lot on Batman and other DC heroes. I wasn't so much of a Marvel fan when I was a little kid, but became more of one later. And then the other really geeky deep cut here was Gold Key Comics, because there was a hero named Turok who was a Native American who fought dinosaurs. Like how could any kid resist a comic like that?
Yeah,
Uh,
I want to make a geeky reference and just say I am Turok. But anyway,
there we go.
that's yeah.
Also, like really young, I watched Star Trek. I remember a little bit seeing it, when it was being aired, but I think really, to be fair, my saturation in Star Trek to the point where I could probably recite the dialogue from any episode. I watched the reruns so many times. Were the reruns that they were on a lot, and I was very happy to just sort of drench myself in Star Trek at an early age. Of course, there were cartoons. There were, the this geek adjacent or geek for sure sort of cartoons like Scooby Doo and the Herculoids. That's a really trippy cartoon from my youth. Johnny Quest. When Star Trek the animated series came out, still somewhat surprised that was an actual show for kids. I'm not sure how many kids who didn't watch the original Star Trek TV series really enjoyed that, but who knows? He also got heavily into monster movies, and I think the Bible at the time was the famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, which we'll probably talk about in a future episode. But it was just sort of the almost like the Wikipedia of monster movies at the time. Like if you really wanted to see what the uh, collection of different science fiction, fantasy, horror, or just plain weird movies there were out there, it was from that magazine. There were toys galore when I was a kid, not just Batman, which I remember having a Batman playset when I was a little kid, but also Major Matt Mason and the connection to the space program, which I think if you were a geek at that time, you were definitely big on the space program. There were TV shows when I was young. The Outer Limits was, I think, a little bit more nichey, but something I really enjoyed from a very young age. And the Twilight Zone, of course. There were interestingly for someone that young, movies that engaged me that were really pitched at an adult audience. I mean, I can say I did not understand everything about 2001 when we saw it in a drive-in in Southern California, especially the end. That was particularly baffling to me as a youngster, but it's like I wanted to know what this was about. And also Planet of the Apes had a big impact at that time. And then last of all, what I'll mention as part of my early life as a geek, as a kid or as a preteen, certainly books. So I think I'd categorize what I was reading at that time into big idea science fiction. So authors like Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, Larry Niven, people like that, and also what I would put into the bucket of adventure fiction more. Not to say that that's trivial, because I think Lord of the Rings was more than just a throwaway read, but The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Conan, those sorts of things I also read at an early age. So that's my early history. How about you, Stephen?
So in some ways, the very, very foundational things are very similar, right? It's Batman, it's Star Trek. One I'll throw in that you didn't mention, which is it's sort of, I guess, sci-fi adjacent, but still it had significant sci-fi elements with Speed Racer. Speed Racer was a
Oh
huge
yeah.
impact when I was 5 and 6 years
Mhm.
old, 4, 5 and 6 years old. In fact, all of these things, I think, very early on, we're talking about the era in which you watch what was on television when it was on television. You had to know when it was on. It was very important to know when things were on. And sort of the rhythm of the day in some ways. Speed
Mhm.
Racer was on in the later afternoon, sort of what would have been after school at that point. It wasn't maybe in school, depending. And Star Trek was always on Channel 39 in Dallas in the evenings. And like you, I could certainly quote the show. Probably still could. Um, and Batman was also something that very much captured my imagination. All of these things, especially Batman and Star Trek, my mother specifically introduced me to. Um, and, and of course that spun into toys. I still have um, outside the view of the camera, and of course we're audio here, but still have my Star Trek Mego characters from back in the 1970s. I used to have all the, a lot of the superhero characters. Um, and of course, this did lead to interesting comic books. At the time, comic books were just this sort of random thing you ran into, right? For me,
Mhm.
they used to have, I'm sure you had did the same thing. You would go to the drugstore or wherever you happened to be, the grocery store, and on the spinner rack there would be this three comics in a bag. Usually something on the outside that was appealing, and the one in the middle nobody
Mhm.
wanted, but because you couldn't see what it was. But that was, and so it was like I never early on didn't have like runs of issues. I didn't even know how you could get runs of issues. It was just whatever I happened to come across is what I had. I think it's funny. One sticks in my head because I think my mother would read it to me because it had to have been before I could fully read. It was Batman 246, and the title was "How Many Ways Can a Robin Die?" That is stuck in my head for 50 plus years now. And what's kind of funny and somewhat annoying, I have the DC Unlimited app on my iPad now, and that issue, for whatever reason, is not available. I have no idea why.
Hmm.
But it was a Neil Adams cover, and the interior, I was
I
not.
remember that issue too.
Yeah, yeah. It was just
Yeah.
that one just stuck in my head for forever. And it really was just a stack of comics on my bookshelf until they all kind of disintegrated and got thrown away. And at that point, yeah, it was almost exclusively DC. I don't think I really had any Marvel comics at that point. And maybe some smattering of other things that were not sci-fi, like Archie or Richie Rich and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that was the really early on stuff. And also a toy that was very important to me were Micronauts.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and Lego in general. And I used Lego to build spaceships. That was mostly what I did with Legos. Um, and then sort of Star Wars was huge because I was 10 years old. Well, actually, I was 9 years old when it came out, but it really was that summer. I mean, it was in the theaters for so long, but Star Wars was huge in sort of my science fiction inculcation. And the first real science fiction or fantasy or geek book that really impacted me was The Hobbit. There was a cartoon, a Rankin and Bass cartoon movie that was on in 1977
Mhm.
that really wasn't very good, but it captured my imagination. And my mother had the book. She'd been an English teacher and had taught the book when it was sort of popular in the 60s. And I read it. I all kinds of times. I don't know how many times I read The Hobbit. And then I remember I was at a friend's house in sixth grade, and they had premium cable. If it was HBO or not, whatever it would have been at the time, and it had the Lord of the
Mhm.
Rings, that the movie that I'm forgetting who made it now.
Oh, Ralph Bakshi.
That's the one,
Yeah.
and just being truly entranced by that story and reading the book in sixth grade, I can still see in my middle school library exactly where that book was on the shelf. And they only had the Fellowship of the Ring, so I had to go and buy the others, which is fine. Um, but those were the things that really drew me in. And then later, of course, as you say, or not long thereafter, it's Asimov and it's Niven and people like that that really impacted me early on.
Okay. And it's funny you mentioned the spinner rack. Well, not too funny. The spinner rack also played a big part in my geek life at a tender age. So if you don't know what a spinner rack is, kids, it was exactly what it sounded like. It was a rack that turned around. It was made out of wire, and you had issues of comics jammed into it. And there was one of these at the local drugstore where I went with my mom regularly, and I started buying comics out of that. And these were certainly better than the gold key comics I had been reading a while earlier. And there was a guy who worked there, Jerry, we got to know, who was also a comics fan. And he sort of introduced us to the local comics club. Um, and that was sort of a revelation because there were lots of people, including lots of adults, who were big into comics. I got into mostly, Batman and Thor were my characters when I was young. And so you could go then to this place you never knew existed before, this club meeting, and talk to people about comics and buy comics off people, back issues. You were talking about the difficulty of getting back issues.
Oh wow.
Or I was on the hunt at at a local used bookstore that had drops once a week of back issue comics that the owner had purchased from people, and so it was this really great treasure hunt. I used to go with a friend of mine who was a Daredevil fan, and I would go after the Thor stuff from the Marvel comics piles. But you quickly dig through those, and you'd find what you didn't have, and occasionally you would find some incredible back issues from these drops. But I remember Green Lantern, Green Arrow '76, the first Dennis O'Neill, Neil Adams uh, issues that they did together for a pivotal run. Uh, at at the West Coast Comics Club meetings, my mom, who was unmarried at the time and played a big part in my early geek life, she was very encouraging and she was very helpful in ways you'll hear about in a moment. She met my future stepfather, and uh, they eventually married. He had a comic store called Bob's Comics, and that was in Orange County, California. And so this was the mother lode. Oh my God, so many comics now I had access to as a result of that. And we went to a lot of conventions, because that's what you did when you were a comics dealer, in both new issues and back issues. You went to conventions in the area. I used to go all the time to the San Diego Comics Con in its early years with my family. Met a lot of writers because it was also a science fiction bookstore, and so science fiction writers would come in for author events, and got to meet them as well as other people who were in the comics business. Um, and eventually, we kind of expanded the aperture of what we were doing to include other things. And this is a theme we're going to talk about a bit, I think, throughout this podcast, is how just easily things that seem distinct from one another became quickly and sort of organically connected to one another. So I got into board games, war games in particular, and a lot of those games that came out from companies like Avalon Hill and SPI at the time, there were science fiction and fantasy games as well as historical ones. And so, my stepfather and mother kindly decided that they wanted to include those sorts of games in the inventory of the store. So you had, again, comics, books, and games. And then when Star Wars came out, which had a gigantic impact, I can remember watching Star Trek at the premiere from the front row, and what a mind-blowing moment it was when the Star Destroyer came overhead at the beginning of the movie. Then there was all this movie merchandise related to Star Wars and to some extent Star Trek as well that became part of the inventory. So that was, I would say, the fulcrum around which my early geek life turned was, the comics club, the bookstore, and everything else I just mentioned. How about you?
So yeah, I mean, I didn't have the awesome opportunity to actually have someone in the family own a bookstore, but I mean, I think bookstores they were certainly central, right? And libraries, it's all about books in many ways, right? But bookstores, when I was again the elementary school early on, when I was able to kind of start looking for what I wanted to look at, it was my mother always liked to go to used bookstores. My mother's a very avid reader, and we lived in Temple, Texas, and there was a place called the Bookseller because it was like a cellar like down the stairs. Play on words, as many bookstores
Mhm.
do apparently. But that was a place I could look for science fiction books, but also they just had stacks and stacks of used comics. They weren't in great shape, but you could sit there and you could, as you point out, you could just sort of hunt through them. I mean, you mentioned the hunt in general. I mean, that's something that I think was really endemic to geek life, especially in the '70s, right? You couldn't necessarily find everything you wanted. There might be
Right.
whether it's a comic in a particular comic, a particular number of comic in a series, a book,
A
even a
movie.
toy, a movie. You just,
Yeah.
or you want to see it. You just want to see a particular episode of Star Trek, and you had to wait and wait and wait until, oh, finally, I haven't seen this one in forever, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
The hunt was very much endemic to all of it, and and then I think really, and I was trying to think when I really started quote unquote collecting comics versus just reading them. I'm probably around 11 or 12, maybe 12. But I know that we moved to Waco, Texas, and there was place called the Golden Book Exchange, and that place was a used bookstore and comic shop. And they had, you could get, they would, the whole thing where you could tell them what books you wanted. They would all put them in the back, so they would be there when you came every
Hmm.
week, and the long boxes full of back issues and what have you. And it became this sort of central place to find these things. And over time, that was always been the case. When we moved to California, you've had to find a comic shop, um, and of course, that's all transformed now. And like I made a passing reference to the iPad. I mean, now I can look at the entire Marvel catalog and the entire DC catalog on my iPad, which is cool, but it does take away some of the magic, right?
Hmm.
Of the hunt and of finding these things. But yeah, it started to become. And I was thinking again, I mentioned already, but it was really 1977, 1978 for me. That's The Hobbit and Star Wars all in one little sort of
Yeah.
maybe 6 month for me time frame, and then the Lord of the Rings books and all of that exploded from there. And the and getting into Asimov and reading all the robot books were very hugely important to me. And then the Lige Bailey books, which are also part of the robot series, but that became kind of the evolution from iRobot
Hmm.
to the rest of the robots to uh, the Lige Bailey books, and then the Foundation books, um, and Roger Zelazny was a revelation.
Hmm.
That was a sort of high school discovery. That's when I read Dune. All of these things sort of expanding these universes, and I think, and I realized sort of retrospectively that one of the things that appealed to me about all of this was universe building and world building and trying to understand all of the components. I
Hmm.
think I reflect sometimes about how my professional life in as a professor was sort of foreshadowed and being excited by finding like footnotes in Marvel comics, or oh, I can go and find this stuff out. You can do quote unquote research, or things like the appendices in Lord of the Rings. The end of the Return of the King was just, I was over the moon about that kind of stuff. And so another revelatory thing that was pivotal was the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the radio dramas that I discovered when they broadcast on NPR back in, I was in middle school at the time. But it was always sort of this questing about it, right? And as
Hmm.
you say too, it does lead into other things like video games, or role-playing games first, and then video games. Again, I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and then Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then dabbled with a variety of other RPGs over time. Traveler and Champions and some other things. Before then, on early Apple II and then early Windows
Yeah.
DOS machines, playing various computer games, mostly trying to replicate the Dungeons and Dragons experience, right?
Hmm. Yeah. I
And
remember fondly coming to your house one time.
yes,
Played one of the SSI gold box games. I don't
yes,
remember which one. Yeah.
I do remember those were great games. Pool of
Hmm.
Radiance was the first one. I don't remember. I was thinking about that just the other day, but I was even
Yeah.
thinking about before that, right? The text-based games where you're like literally trying to like wander around in the dark, like
Oh,
Zork.
yeah.
And there was one, and I trying to remember what it was called. It was the first one I played was on the Apple II Plus, and it was a
Hmm.
text-based thing, but it was like go left, go right, and you're trying to guess what commands the computer will even accept, because you couldn't.
Hmm.
It wasn't exactly natural language models. It was
Yeah.
it was it was a limited vocabulary that you had to figure out what you could do, and you could hit. But all of this sort of the capacity to explore, dare I use the term, strange new worlds, right? That's what all this was about. It was very exciting. And then, as I think we'll talk about maybe more today, but over time, right, the way in which early on it was this sort of whatever you could get your hands on, right?
Yes.
Including often not very good TV and movies, because at least it featured something from this world that you found fascinating, like you know, the Wonder Woman TV show or the Incredible Hulk or whatever in the 1970s, which are pretty cheesy.
Don't get me mad,
But
Mr. McGee. You wouldn't
you
like
won't
me when
like
I'm
me when
mad.
I'm angry. That's right. um, but oh,
Yeah, I mean that's really important. That scarcity really kind of drove us to become more eclectic. So
yes,
you'd go to the bookstore where you would look for back issues that you didn't have of some comic you like, the Avengers or the Justice League or whatever. And if you were disappointed that you didn't find it, you'd have the proprietor there say, well, you like the Micronauts. How about you try this book, Starship Troopers,
Right.
or you know, try this other book. If you like Lord of the Rings, maybe you'd like something else that we have in stock.
Yeah, it was the constancy of discovery.
Yeah.
I mean, the library is also falls in this category. It's something that doesn't really happen anymore, at least rarely. I mean, you would go to the bookshelf to find a book and find something else because you didn't know to look
Hmm.
for it.
Yeah.
Um, that was always exciting, or just perusing the bookstore in general, trying to find something new.
Yeah. I,
Um,
I I think it also gave us an appreciation for earnest but bad efforts at things.
oh
Right.
yes,
Like, so you were saying you had to wait a long time to watch a particular episode of Star Trek. Well, you had to wade through Spock's brain and the
yes,
alternative factor to finally get to the
that's right,
Doomsday Machine,
that's right.
or Journey to Babel.
That's right. Yeah, because you had no choice. This is just, it is, like I said, it was what was on, and that's when it was on. And that's
Yes.
the way it was. Um,
Yeah. And the TV shows you were mentioning, for those who haven't seen those who are listening to this podcast, they were cheesy.
yes.
They were pretty
Oh, yes.
cheesy.
They were very much were cheesy. Yeah, I was kind of going through a list of shows. I mean, it was whatever it was, anything that sort of had this just the slightest spark of science fiction or fantasy. I was always willing to watch, right? And
Yeah.
it often wasn't that great. Um, and some of it, your age it doesn't matter. Like Lost in Space is very cheesy, but I loved it as a kid.
Yeah.
Over time, I like less so. But things like um, uh, the Time Tunnel and Land of the Giants, which was 1960 stuff.
Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea.
Yeah, all those
which
kinds of
which were
things.
really trippy shows. I mean, and again, I want to
Yes.
say these were earnest efforts that
Oh,
didn't
yes.
always work, and I think that has an effect on us, at least that has made us enjoy shows like Mystery Science Theater. But
Yes, absolutely.
Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea had just one crazy thing after another, as did Lost in Space. So I remember vividly the Lobster Man episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, or
There was the carrot guy on Lost in Space.
yeah, yeah,
I just love the robot for the most part.
oh yeah,
Uh, but and even things that I discovered later, I suppose I had a tolerance for that you would have a hard time to have a tolerance for now. Like I discovered classic Doctor Who in high school, and it was Tom Baker's The Fourth Doctor. But
hmm
those shows, which I still watch sometimes now, are they're one, the effects are all obviously terrible. The acting it varies
hmm
considerably, as does the writing. And they're very plotting, right?
yeah. Well, Doctor
But
Who, every planet had a palace that was made out of cardboard, and
yes,
about five people were employed there.
usually, usually, there only happen to be three Daleks that happen to invade this planet. Um, that was always great. Um, I mean, as opposed to like, modern Doctor when they can CG hundreds of Daleks. It's a very different kind of experience.
Mhm.
But I mean, another show that I don't know if you watched or not. Did you ever watch Blake Seven?
I did not. I did not. That was not
That
on my.
maybe we should look into that maybe for a future episode. But it was
Yeah.
also, the effects were just awful. It was almost low budget Doctor Who, but it was groundbreaking in its own kind of way. But yeah, I suppose there was a tolerance for all that, and really it was amazing. Well, actually, before I even say that, I mean, forget even Wonder Woman and the Hulk. I mean, do you remember the Captain America movie with he was on a motorcycle in the motorcycle helmet? Oh,
Sadly,
that
yes.
was, oh gosh, and the original attempt at a Spider-Man TV show was pretty awful.
Yeah. But we
Um,
watched it.
oh, of course we watched it,
Yeah.
and that's why things like, although again in retrospect they're not as impressive, but I mean, Superman the motion picture or even Batman in 1989 was just leaps and bounds beyond, no pun
Hmm.
intended, what we would get in the 70s.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And to foreshadow, I think, future conversations, it is stunning, even though maybe the MCU has gotten a little stale. The capacity to take those comic book adventures we read as kids and actually put them on the screen is rather remarkable, really.
It is, yeah. And again, back in the day, they were trying.
They were trying.
They were trying. So for me, some later developments I'll mention. I said I got into games. I didn't talk about D&D much, but I was there with D&D from some of the earliest days. I had, if you know anything about the history of D&D, the white box set, one of the first that came out, and it had the three books in it,
Yes.
and with the really terrible art in them, but
Yes.
and the very confusing rules. But yeah, that was revelatory, at the time, that you could put together your own fantasy story using a game, and then later other games came out that let you explore other aspects of geek culture, science fiction, horror, whatever. Um, Star Wars was, of course, huge, and the sequels. Um, I still to this day do not understand how so many people showed up to the first day of Star Wars. I mean, there was a big line. And we'll talk about this when we get to Star Wars,
Sure,
but
sure, sure.
yeah, I mean, but it was clear that there was a broader appetite
Yes.
for what we were ourselves very deeply in already in the bigger non-geek population. I also got big into video games, particularly computer games. And again, they were themselves, very often science fiction, fantasy, the sort of tropes that we were reading or watching at the time. There were a lot of TV shows. I'll add some more to the list aside from Doctor Who. I think the Tom Baker years are the sweet spot for Doctor Who. Um, there's also Kolchak, the Night Stalker, the Prisoner, uh, Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, Space 1999. Uh, what's interesting about these shows is that they were very mixed quality. I think the Prisoner and Kolchak I would watch again, and those at a heartbeat. Space 1999 I thought was silly from the pilot. Uh,
Well, you don't think the moon can blow off the orbit of the Earth and go at hyperspeed or whatever the heck it did? Yeah,
no, I didn't. It really just I think that was like the limit I was reaching for desperation. Is like I watch a lot of things, but this is really stretching it.
so yeah, I
Uh,
was young enough. I remember because I remember watching Space 1999, but intermittently because it was syndicated in a weird kind of way, which was unusual for the time, right? Because no network
yeah.
picked it up. It was a British show,
Mhm.
but yeah, I it didn't. I was what, seven, six? I don't know,
Yeah.
seven, maybe eight, and it was I didn't catch on to the whole moon thing until later. I actually haven't seen it in forever. And the Prisoner, I don't think I encountered the Prisoner till I was in maybe college or grad school.
Yeah.
So it was a different experience, but yeah, it has a certain uh 60s British TV quality to it
Well,
with
there's
the
an
giant
interesting
balloon.
aspect. Yeah, the interesting aspect of the delivery system for some of what we're talking about here. You mentioned the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy
Yes,
radio series, but also The Prisoner and Doctor Who. So that was on NPR, right? So the other delivery vehicle I want to mention for Doctor Who and The Prisoner was PBS, like
yes,
our local PBS station, because the BBC had agreements with PBS to license things. Um, would then distribute things like Blake Seven, though I didn't watch it
yes,
at the time, but Doctor Who, The Prisoner, and they were kind of given a little bit of more cachet legitimacy, I think.
yes.
Even though they were like late at night, and there was like a weird guy who gave the intro to The Prisoner in our local
Hmm.
uh, uh, PBS market. It was something that was not treated as silly. Um,
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so that's PBS is how I got Doctor Who and Blake Seven. The Prisoner again, I think I may have gotten via cable at some point
yeah,
later, like on, I don't know. I don't doesn't matter. But you're right. Well, PBS was this sort of interesting gateway to all of this alternate culture to begin with, right? That's
yeah,
how I saw Monty Python, Blackadder and things like that, which are not sci-fi, but still kind of fit
Still,
into they fit into that sort of geeky realm in many ways.
well, yeah, I think if you
Um,
were a geek, you were able to quote Monty Python.
oh, Able required.
Required. so
Compulsively so, as
yeah,
my wife will attest to this day.
yeah, so this was an era too. I'll mention that, the number of serious science fiction movies really spiked. And I
Yes,
shouldn't say science fiction, I should say, all the aspects of geek culture, science
true.
fiction, fantasy, horror. So I put together a list, Superman, the movie,
Hmm.
Alien, Close Encounters, Indiana
Right.
Jones, lesser known things like the Andromeda Strain, Silent Running, Logan's Run, Westworld, Soylent Green, Fantastic Planet, a very trippy animated movie, and like the Planet of the Apes sequels, were all the 1970s,
Yes.
which all also became, more or less mainstream properties.
Yeah, you'd mentioned Planet of the Apes, and that was one I should have said too. That was one I remember encountering at probably the same age I was talking about some other things in elementary school, and those movies made an impact. Um, because they would rerun on the local TV station in Dallas, one after the other.
Hmm.
They run all five in a week sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned my mother liking and introduced me to a lot of this stuff. She did not care for the Planet of the Apes for whatever reason, or at least after the first one, they got on her nerves. But actually, Andromeda Strain, I remember now watching that too on TV at some point. Something else that in sort of movies, the Wizard of Oz used to be an annual event on TV, right? To watch the Wizard of Oz. Then that has certainly certain fantasy elements
Hmm.
to it, clearly, that was influential at the time. But you're right. I mean, there was this sort of explosion of these movies, um, often exploring. Boy, also, we'll definitely talk about it later at a later podcast. Sort of the all of the see the Cold War apocalyptic stuff was a
Oh
constant
yeah.
theme in all of these things, whether it was environmental disasters, nuclear disasters, overcrowding, all of these things. In those Logan's Run also was
Hmm.
in that mix and was a TV show briefly. I remember watching again as a kid because why not? It's science fiction. Um,
Yeah.
or one that's on my list. I'm skipping around, but looking at my list of things just from the 70s, TV shows. A good example of something I would watch because I was desperate for anything science fiction. And I don't know if you watched it or not. Do you remember Salvage One?
I remember it. I didn't watch it.
Oh, it was terrible. It was about Andy Griffith started as this junk dealer who realized that there was stuff you could salvage off the moon to make because it was free there to go get. So he
Okay.
built a rocket out of his junk in his
Hmm.
junkyard, including I think a cement mixer was part of the capsule, and he went to the moon and salvaged the stuff.
Okay.
It was terrible. But
Or
oddly,
what was the comedy show with Richard Benjamin?
oh, Quark. That's another
Yes,
one. Yeah,
Quark. Yeah.
I was very excited because it was Star Trek-esque because
Yeah.
it was a Buck
Hmm.
Henry um parody of Star Trek. And he was like, yeah, they were garbage collectors and there was a plant guy and there were the clone sisters or whatever. I can't remember everything now. It's been so long. But yeah, it was terrible, but it had spaceships
But we watched it.
and that's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I'll just mention, kind of like to round out my later developments and, when I became a, high school student and beyond, my reading, of books became broader, so
Sure.
I did, that was when I discovered H.P. Lovecraft. When I really got big into writers like Michael Moorcock as an alternative to standard fantasy, or Frank Herbert's Dune
Hmm.
series, Roger Zelazny, uh, Fritz Leiber, Harlan Ellison, who
Yes.
had a big impact on the science fiction world at the time, and in particular in the Los Angeles area science fiction community. And then other people you haven't probably heard of, like Keith Laumer or others that I really just
Oh
became a
yes. Those are
voracious reader. Yeah.
that's was that the I don't know how you say it.
Retief
Red. Yes. Yes. I got it.
or
All those.
yeah, or
Also,
Saberhagen, the Bolo books, and
I'm familiar with them.
or
I never read
Berserker
them.
books. I'm sorry, Berserker
Berserker.
books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did read
Yeah.
those Lomer books, and they are also very heavily influenced by the Cold War.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's very much sort of the Soviets and the U.S. as the but you mentioned Ellison, and I think the first time I encountered Ellison, and I'm sure I know we've talked about this in the past, but when I moved to California in high school, I discovered the radio show Hour 25.
Yes.
And that's where I don't know if I'd read Ellison, I don't think I had. And and he used to be a regular guest, and all of that sort of, that was a broadening experience, that program. Um,
Yeah. I have an hour 25 anecdote I'll save for the D&D episode when we do it.
Fair enough.
Okay.
The hour
Do
that
something,
stretches.
give a hook for our
Sure.
listeners.
Oh, no, it's all very exciting. I'm sure everyone's very
Keep
excited
listening.
about all of these things that we're going to pontificate about.
Oh, yeah.
But yes,
So we're talking about geek culture entering the mainstream to an extent at this point. Um, so
yes,
Superman, the movie was huge. Star
yes.
Wars was huge. Alien was huge, so
Close
we
Encounters
had,
was huge.
yeah, Close Encounters was huge. So how did you feel about it when those things became popular
So
aspects of popular culture?
I think that I was just young enough, perhaps, to not fully recognize what a big deal it was
Hmm.
until maybe retrospectively. And certainly there was a certain amount of excitement that there was this much content that was being generated. And again, a higher quality content than was generated in the 70s on balance.
Hmm.
Although I mean, some of this is the late 70s. So really, I guess this really starts, as I've said before, around 77, 78. I mean, Star Wars comes out, if I recall properly, comes out actually in 77, right?
Yes.
But it really hit my mental space in 78. And I know I saw the movie so many times, it's kind of hard to keep track. Part of the reason I remember 78 is my I have twin brothers and sisters that are almost exactly 10 years younger than I am. And that summer, when my mother was very pregnant, all of her friends took my sister and I to the movies, and we saw Star Wars over and over and over again, which
Hmm.
was perfectly fine. But so it really, in some ways, in my mind, is a phenomenon of 1978. But I think we actually saw it when it first came out in 77. Um, but the yeah, Superman, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, all these movies, it was a sort of revelation, and this sort of this sort of movement toward higher quality special effects that made these stories seem more real and less
Hmm.
cardboard um, than perhaps some of what we'd watched when we were younger, especially
Yeah.
things like the monster movies and things like that did have not particularly great special effects or Lost in
Yeah, I mean,
Space. I mean,
2001 was the standout among
yes,
movies.
that's true. Which I don't think I saw. I was way too young for 2001. I probably didn't see 2001 until I was in high school, maybe.
Hmm.
Because when 2010 came out, I remember that was, I know I watched it before 2010 came out, which came
Okay.
out, I forget when now. When I lived in California, that much I remember. So 80s, in the 80s.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, but just in the Star Wars, the Star Trek movies were a big deal to me.
Hmm.
That was a big deal to me because it revived this thing that I thought was dead, right?
Yeah.
Um, and seeing all those at the theater was a big deal. And of course, the thing that was also true at the time, which is less true now, is you had to wait so long between all these things to come out. It was just massive.
Hmm.
There's always 3 years at least between movies. It seemed like I know the Star Wars movies were all 3 years apiece, and it was always this sort of anticipation. And one of the interesting things to me to think about, which has changed, is the degree to which it used to really feel like it was a very limited supply. Right? I mean, we
Yeah.
got 3 Star Wars movies, and that was it. And if you want any more Star Wars, it was either play with your toys, which I
Hmm.
had a large number. It was books at some points and comics to a degree, but um, it was like this very, very limited supply of these things
Yeah.
that is maybe oversupplied now. We could talk about that also later, but is definitely different.
Right. And I don't know how much, I don't know if this is an answerable question or not. I'm going to pose. I don't know how much necessarily those big cultural events, the release of Star Wars or the release of the Superman movie or whatever, kind of drove people to become more geekified the way that we were. Like that,
Yes.
people who were not, aficionados like us would certainly go see those movies, but they didn't necessarily show up at our store
Right.
and say, hey, could you recommend a science fiction novel to me?
That's right. No, I think it is interesting, and I think and I did some research on these words, right? Nerd and geek,
Hmm.
and and I was trying to think first, like when did the words come to mean what we currently use them to mean, which is really the sort of linkage to this culture that we're talking about. Because like when we were in the 70s, I don't think anybody referred to one as a geek, certainly not a geek, and even a nerd was more just a square or boring person, uh, as the terminology was at the time, and not really someone affiliated with like, oh, you like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. Um, or as I made passing reference to earlier, if you look at nerd archetypes in TV, whether it's Potsy from Happy Days or Urkel or someone
Hmm.
like that, they were all just goofy people who were awkward, or in Urkel's case, wore glasses, suspenders, and had a funny
Yeah.
voice. Um, Likewise on SNL or whatever, these manifestations of nerds, and then there's this transition, right? And you look at something like Big Bang Theory, where they're all nerdy and they're all like wearing Green Lantern T-shirts and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
Or I was looking again at one of my favorite Weird Al songs is White and Nerdy, which it sort of has both, right? He's got the glasses and he's kind of dressed funny, but he also is like in the song worrying about whether he likes Captain Kirk or Picard, and his all these kinds of more D&D things and all this kind of
Hmm.
business. So this sort of merger, and it becomes more about that kind of thing than just about being socially awkward. Um, so I think that it also gets associated with technology, right?
Yeah.
Computers, and I think that. Uh, I mean, I remember making the joke when I was teaching sometimes that nerds run the world these days, which is kind of true,
Hmm.
right? In ways it really wasn't necessarily in the past. People like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs were nerds or geeks, um, and now all the not to get too much into contemporary politics at this point, but people like Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy or all these guys, they've made their money in technology, and they are kind of
Yeah.
nerdy and kind of geeky in a particular kind of way. And you throw on top of it things like the MCU just made a ridiculous amount of money,
Right.
and maybe this is capitalism for the win, right? I mean, nerds
Hmm.
become mainstream because they become profitable.
Yeah.
And Star Wars is the beginning of that, right? I mean, really, Star Wars more than anything else.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
definitely.
I don't know if you
Yeah,
have
this
thoughts
was
about
really,
that.
yeah, I think this is really the birth of properties, you can go back to maybe the Superman TV show or the
Sure.
Batman TV show, and then all the like the associated toys and breakfast cereals and other things you
Yes.
could get at the time, but it was never as huge as I think it
No.
was with Star Wars and the ilk that followed, or even
And just
Planet of the Apes. When we get to Planet of the Apes, we'll talk about Planet of the Apes merchandising, which I think is a
yes.
yeah.
I mean, I think your merchandising clearly is always been a huge part of this, as you
Hmm.
point out. I mean, like Superman or Batman, either one. I mean, you can go
Hmm.
back in time, whether it's the radio serials and then the movie serials, and then all the merchandising that comes along with
Yeah.
all that. But um, I'm always I'm gonna maybe being speaking out of school, I should do my research. But as I recall, um, Lucas got a huge boost because when they signed the toy deal, he got a cut of it, and no one thought it would be a big deal, and he made a lot of money
Oh
off of
yeah.
those toys. And those toys were ubiquitous. I mean, it actually is kind of amazing the number of the characters they made into figures.
Hmm.
Um, and all, I mean, it was just a deluge of those things. And I think that really was a particular moment in time for merchandising that was new, right?
Hmm.
And I don't know. So you all had the store at that point, so you saw this up close, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was,
But
again, I think it was popular to the extent that people, especially, younger people, kids,
yes,
would go after all the merchandising, but not the grown-ups. I mean, you wouldn't see, a lot of adults walking around, with, Close Encounters T-shirts.
No, that's right.
A little bit, but not tons. Not like you see today.
No, no, it's become far more normal. It's
Yeah,
not seen as weird.
yeah.
Um, and I just wondered the degree to which, I mean, I don't know, it's a chicken and the egg thing, right? I mean, things only become profitable because they're popular.
Hmm.
But well, like, I was looking at top grossing films, right? And they're all these days, they're almost all within the general purview of the concept of geek culture. It's overwhelmingly superhero movies, science fiction movies,
Hmm.
then to a lesser degree, sort of kids movies, the Disney movies, which sometimes have these um, genre elements to them, and a handful of dramas and other kinds of movies. It's just that is what drives Hollywood. I think
Yeah.
it's transformed, and again, this is something we could talk about probably in a whole episode, which is the way in which um, certain kinds of filmed art, certain kinds of dramas, have all moved to television because they just don't have the mass appeal to maintain movie audiences. Right? It's got to
Hmm.
be Superman or the Justice League or Star Wars or something to get people to go to the movie theater these days.
Right. Yeah, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. Sorry, listeners, but I don't have the sense that science fiction and fantasy in the printed form
No,
is as big as that. It's not as big as the book market as it is of movies and
no,
television. It's bigger than it was,
sure,
but it's not as big. So I think one of the things we'll be talking about is just how different aspects of geekdom become more mainstream and others less so. Like at this time, if you told somebody, I've just been turned on to this new game called Dungeons and Dragons, and it's great, they would kind of look at you a little bit blankly and say, "Bless your heart." It wouldn't be, quite the same impact as saying, "Hey, do you want to go see the second Star Wars movie next
right.
weekend?"
Well, I mean, it's to my recollection, right? I mean, the comics industry, Marvel and DC, were actually dealing with substantial financial shortfalls
Oh
before
yeah.
they sold their properties to or licensed them or I guess in the case of Marvel, sold to Disney. That's what kept all that alive, right?
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, comics shifted in the time that we were reading them. We started reading them when they were written for kids, and
Hmm.
then in the 80s, the ridiculous boom of collectibles where they tried to like capitalize on the scarcity of books that were scarce for real reasons and then like overprinted. I
Right.
mean, how many variation covers of Todd McFarlane's, Spider-Man could there possibly be? Oh my gosh,
The
that
answer
one
is
has
too many.
foil on it. Yeah, I know, it's way too many.
Yeah.
Um, that one's sealed, never open that one because that'll be worth lots of
Uh,
money.
God,
Uh-huh. Yeah, I
you'll
mean,
be able to send your grandkids to
yeah.
college with that.
And to where, I mean, really, my I don't I know I've read some of this. I mean the market for comic books is mostly to like adults now, right? I mean, they're not aimed
Yeah.
at kids, they're aimed at, I'm not sure what the target age is these days, but I don't mean adult in the adult sense, just simply people that are probably in their 20s are more likely to read comic books than people in their
Right.
teens, their elementary school or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, the spinner rack has been gone for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah. So that again was a great entry point for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
So
thing
go ahead.
one thought, and then I'm sorry to, but I because of things like Amazon, I don't go to bookstores
Hmm.
like I used to. This thing that used to be very important to me. But we were in a bookstore recently, one of the few that still exist around here. And one that did strike me, one of the largest sections in Books a Million, which is a local chain here in this
Hmm.
part of the country, is manga. There's like this huge manga section, which I never
Yeah.
really got into, but that still exists apparently. But
Yeah.
the
I
sci-fi
know.
section is
I
much
know.
smaller.
Yeah. Yeah. And graphic novels,
Yes.
or let's just say, compendiums of comic books.
Yes, that's right.
All right. So why don't we kind of push ahead to kind of
Sure.
like the end game of this first episode?
Yes.
So the things that most resemble the geek culture that we grew up with that exists today, and how we feel about, the, kind of the geek culture today. Something we'll talk about a lot. I just wanted to kind of throw in a couple of observations. I mean, I think science fiction and fantasy fiction still resemble a lot of the fiction that I read when I was young.
Yes.
I think there are movies occasionally, that have that feel to me, and it's going to be like Moon, Europa Report, District 9,
Mm.
Monsters, a lot of things probably people listening to this podcast didn't catch,
All right.
or they're the only ones who caught it because, of the audience for this podcast. How about you? I mean, what to
Yeah, I mean,
you?
I think the things that it's all echoes of my past, right? Though it
Mhm.
is things like Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, which at least tries to
Yeah,
capture this thing from the past, but that's sort of very conscious. Um, I'm
Firefly.
yeah, I'm also struck. It's all echoes though. Like some of the stuff that you see in some of the Marvel movies are really capitalizing on storylines that were popular when we were younger.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
or the current revival of X-Men 97 on Max that is using storylines that I remember when I read the comic back in the 90s or 80s.
hmm
Um, but you're right. I mean, it's
Andor, The Mandalorian.
yeah.
Mandalorian especially felt
Oh
like
yeah,
the most Star Wars initial trilogy, like, of all
absolutely,
things that have come
absolutely.
since the first three movies.
So I guess for me, what it kind of feels like is that it's just become again, because it's become so mainstream, it's more saturated.
hmm
So I'm familiar with all of it, right? It all
hmm
feels familiar to a certain degree, even if it's not always identical. The part that's probably still the most like when I was younger is the literature, not the movies and TV, because they've become so much more sophisticated. And even you know, I don't know I have anything beyond that to say about it.
Okay. I think there are other things that, certainly do have the feel of, the old days. I think like in role playing games, has been a very self-conscious effort to, the old school revival or renaissance or
Right.
whatever that acronym means, and I don't think it's just those games. I think there are other ones that, without necessarily consciously parroting what it was like to be Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson's D&D,
Right.
just still have that old feel. I think, again, I think I'm a much bigger fan of the old monster movies than you are. I'll opine about why this movie about giant ants was terrific and why this other movie about a giant praying mantis was stupid. But not a lot of
Well,
things that have the same feel, except for maybe like, Godzilla minus one, which I thought was fantastic. Um, so it's been, kind of an interesting time to, kind of see all this go super mainstream,
yes.
but not exactly in the ways that we grew up with these these genres or particular properties or whatever. Um,
Yeah, I guess I sort of struggle with the question because like I say, I feel like it's all around me. These things that like whether it's the various Star Trek shows, the various Star Wars shows, the MCU, um, or Foundation on Apple TV Plus.
mhm.
It's all of
Yeah.
these properties that are, or the new Dune movies. Um, on the one level, it's familiar because the particular property is there, and I recognize and identify with this
hmm
property. Like Foundation is a good example of I guess, of what I'm trying to say. On the one hand, like here's this thing that was beloved to me when I was in middle school and high school, but it's redone in a way that really is only it's really inspired by more than it is an adaptation. I don't know if you watched it or not. Um, I think it's fairly well done, but it is this echo of this thing that I used to love in this new package. It's
Yeah.
only flashier than anything, more the visuals and the production value will beyond anything that I would have imagined when I was reading the book and whenever I was reading it. Um, so it's this thing that's there, along with again all these other manifestations, even things I don't necessarily watch anymore. Like I haven't watched all the Star Wars stuff. I haven't watched all the MCU stuff. I did for a while, but it becomes almost impossible to keep up with after a while. So it's this the this these foundational things from my past are now just all around me, and that's I think the thing that I find kind of fascinating about all of it.
Yeah. So
Um,
I realize I was being a bit vague in my earlier comment, but I think that just I wanted to foreshadow what we'll be talking about,
sure.
which is, for the sake of this sort of podcast's goals, being able to say what's different about today,
Hmm.
for better or worse, right? We're not
Right.
saying it's necessarily either.
Right.
Not surprisingly, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about like why the MCU is in some ways a better way of portraying some of those old comic book stories, and in other ways, the original comics did a better job of
Sure.
it. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I know one of the things that I think we're going to
Mm.
foreshadow is, say, Superman or Batman, both. I mean, those have gone through this sort of fascinating evolutions, right, over
Hmm.
time, both in terms of the
Yeah.
comics and in terms of displays in mass media. Um, and 'cause we like with Batman, we both remember not only the campiness of the TV show that we both talked
Oh
about being
yeah.
foundational elements,
Hmm.
which then, but then we both had at least some encounter with that more serious 1970s Dark Knight detective, Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil
Yeah.
stuff.
Absolutely.
And then um, quite consciously the Frank Millerization of Batman,
Hmm.
which in some ways we're still living with, right?
Yes.
Um, and while how that was both revolutionary and fascinating, but also maybe tiresome at this point. Um, not to
We-
foreshadow that whole episode, but
Oh yeah.
but but it is interesting. Sort of, I don't know. Part of this whole exercise is trying to think about origin stories,
Hmm.
and it is also an interesting reflection in my mind about the way in which we experience time.
Yes.
Um, that in some ways, like I said, I can. This is very I can't conjure words all of a sudden. Um, Compounded amount of time, compacted, I guess is the word that I want,
Yes.
right? This
Hmm.
this where I really, as we said at the beginning, it's Batman, Speed Racer, Star Trek, Star Wars, The Hobbit, really in a 5 year period, really, I
Right.
guess, in my consciousness, really from my age 5 to age 10, which is seems like, well, when it's forever ago, it's over half a century ago at this point,
Hmm.
depending on which year we're talking about. And but that is, I have very vivid memories and they're very impactful. And in some
Yeah.
ways, the space between, say, The Dark Knight Rises in 19, what, 84, 85, whenever that
Hmm.
was,
Yeah.
till now feels like a lot less time. I don't know. It's very strange.
No,
Just
I hear you.
and then I guess it's part of the ancientness of the geeks in question. But the
Hmm.
way in which you perceive time and how these things really impacted, I'm sure you have the same experience. I can remember very vivid things that I read that books I maybe read a year ago that I can't remember in the
Yeah.
same kind of way.
Oh
It
yeah.
burns in your brain in a way.
I remember Dune so vividly. I've never
Yes.
reread it. Right?
Mhm.
It's just, and I know that book very well. Enough certainly when going to the movies to know like where plot points have changed, like the
Right.
the ending of the current uh, Dune 2 movie. But yeah, it has a much different impression on your brain. And I think also too, when like we it was compacted not just in just the sheer number of these things, but the
Yes.
variety of them at
Hmm.
that time. It was, I was trying to come up with a phrase to describe this, and the best I could come up with is that, like, you and I grew up with an insatiable appetite for highly imaginative creations.
Yes.
And it just so happened that a lot of those things that weren't as connected as they are now just happened to be around, and then we just, kind of piled them up in front of ourselves and gleefully consumed them.
Yes.
All right. So let's get to here to the end. So we've been talking about themes in this podcast. What it was like to enjoy these things at the beginning, what it was like to enjoy something that was a bit fringy or niche, like in its inception. The
Just being a
connections.
weird, being a weirdo.
Yes, being a weirdo. That okay. Let's cut to the chase. Enough of this highfalutin academic language that you and I
That's right.
like to use.
That's right.
All right. So, talked a bit about like taking what you can get, and kind of the limitations on the
Yes.
consumer. I also think like the theory of constraints, and the people working with low budgets and difficulty getting to their audiences and so forth. As the creators, that's something that's going to come up, and also the kind of the effective large scale commercialization on what geek culture has become. Anything else that you want to just kind of highlight before we
No, I think
wrap
you,
up?
you hit on it. It is sort of this sort of the way in which scarcity, well, the combination really of scarcity and an explosion, right? It was really an
Yeah,
explosion of these things in the 60s into the 70s.
yeah,
Um, and a lot of it really rocketed to at least some level of nationalism very quickly, but it still had these sort of this niche component to it, and trying to experience and understand that, yeah, you were a little on the certain things in particular. Like if you're really into Star Trek or you're really into D&D or Lord of the Rings, I
hmm,
mean, these were things that were considered on the fringe,
yeah,
or just kind of weird. And even if all the terminology hadn't fully congealed by, say,
hmm,
1977 or whatever the case may be. Um, and also sort of the things that were considered a little more broad-based consumption items like Star Wars. Star Wars was considered a little more mainstream, but still, it
yeah,
was still science fiction, still one of those, this came to mind. I remember, again, probably being in middle school and all my quests for comics and visiting my grandmother who lived in Dallas at the time. Of course, Dallas had all kinds of comic shops and bookstores that I
hmm.
didn't have in Temple, Texas, or Waco, Texas. But she would just refer to them as my funny books, which I always found insulting. But it was, but
Yeah,
and not understanding why I cared about these stupid, things.
yeah,
Or when I got the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm digressing, I know, but uh, first it was on as this radio show. Then they made record albums out of it,
hmm,
which I don't know if you're aware of. And I bought one of them at this science fiction store in Dallas, Lone Star Comics and Science Fiction. And I was playing it at my grandmother's house. She did not understand. This was like,
hmm,
is there something wrong with my grandson listening to this stuff? Because she did not get the jokes at all. So there was always there was this sort of, I think it is the, the, the interiority of the whole thing, and the way in which it shaped the way we looked at the world and ourselves. And then again, this overlap between when it became more popular.
yeah,
And it has become far more, again, to be a nerd now is to be kind of cool, or to be a geek.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah. Geek chic.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
And so
that was
it
definitely not
is.
a thing when we were young.
No, not at all. You know, when you showed up with a Batman t-shirt, even in the 1980s, it's like, I don't know, man. I don't know. Um, eh, and you'd have to buy them at specialty stores, right? I mean,
Yeah.
or it was associated with actually Underoos. Remember Underoos?
Oh yeah.
You
Okay.
know, I never had the Underoos, but I remember the commercials. I kind of wanted them because you had the Batman symbol on the t-shirt and your underwear and whatnot. But that was, but Kelly, very aimed at children, right? That was another aspect of all this, right? It was really, if you liked
Hmm.
this stuff, it was childish,
Right. Yeah. Well,
especially as you got
so
into your teen years.
I should mention that when my family had the store, they kind of spread out, with what they were selling. It wasn't just comics, it was books, and then it was
Hmm.
games and so forth. They decided to change the name from Bob's Comics to Warriors, Wizards, and Robots.
Okay.
And I mentioned that for a couple of reasons. One, that's at the same time a terrible name and a
Yeah.
great name,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it caught something about, just
Sure.
exactly how much more expanded the geek world was becoming at that time.
Yes.
The other thing was, I don't think either of those names induced anybody to come in who wasn't already, a fellow traveler in this
That's
particular
right. That's right.
subculture.
No, it was clearly, yeah, it was clearly subculture.
Yeah.
Um, well, I mean, I would have to think about it more completely, but I mean, in the handful of representations that I can think of in pop culture of comic shops,
Right.
they are not exactly presented as grand
Mm.
salons of intellectualism. They are weirdos running these places, right?
Yeah,
Um, and all that goes along with that. So yeah, it
right.
is.
So another theme I think which is coming out organically here is that you and I are going to have a lot to talk about all these things.
Oh yes,
We're just
yes,
bubbling over with things to say in this inaugural episode, and it's going to
absolutely.
happen probably in every episode. But we've got to land this invisible plane sometime.
Yeah,
Comics reference.
very good. And I was
Wink,
going to
wink.
reference Next Generation and say that all good things must come to an end.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. Okay. So in upcoming episodes, we're going to cover a lot of the early days, very early days in our lives, sort of favorites that we had. So the Batman TV show we've alluded to a lot. We'll do an episode on that. Superman in TV and comics. We'll talk about that. Star Trek, certainly the original series, especially, and I know it's not your favorite thing, but monster movies.
Well,
Yeah.
oh no,
Remember, giant ants good,
Giant Ants
giant
good,
mantis
praying
not so
man
good.
bad, very
Bad,
bad,
very bad.
very bad. Well, they eat their mates. It's terrible.
I know. And they, anyway, I won't go into the terrible plot of the deadly mantis. It's not worth it. All right. Well, let's leave it there. Thank
Sounds
you,
good.
Stephen. And thank
Thank
you,
you, Tom.
listeners. And we'll see you next time. That brings us to the end of episode 0 of Ancient Geeks. Thanks for listening. Music is End of Time by Reversed Image, which you can find on Pixelbay. If you like what you hear, leave us a rating or review on the podcast service of your choice. It really helps get the word out about this podcast, and since we're just starting, boy, do we need help getting the word out. If you want to send us suggestions, harsh criticisms, or lavish praise, you can contact us at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. You can also find our group Ancient Geeks on Facebook, and another Ancient Geeks group on Reddit. On Blue Sky, we're, surprise, surprise, Ancient Geeks. All content copyright 2025 by Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. See you next time.